2 weeks of strenuous talks on climate change in Copenhagen wound down with an agreement, but it was non-binding. Was it to avoid an utter failure? And what comes next? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. Taking note of climate change. Some might say that the COP15 summit has acknowledged what most people already know, that action should be taken to halt climate change. But as Alan Fisher reports, that acknowledgement was virtually the only thing the summit was able to agree upon.
I now declare the meeting closed.
This is how the Marathon Copenhagen summit finally ended. After 2 years of planning, 2 weeks of debate, no consensus, only more bitterness and anger at the deal done between America and the world's emerging economies. Exhausted delegates who'd been up all night gave emotional speeches which drove to the heart of the problem.
We believe that one step forward is much better than 2 steps backwards. That's why we support this document, even if it's not perfect.
L9 asked Africa to sign a suicide pact, an incineration pact, in order to maintain the economic dominance of few countries. L9 is devoid of any sense of responsibility, morality, and it is a solution based on values.
The Copenhagen Accord falls well short of what was wanted by those most at risk from climate change, and it has no legal power. Yet the UN Secretary-General believes this is a significant step forward.
I know that both developed and developing countries, they are not all happy. But I believe that through this adoption of Copenhagen Accord, you will be able to get everything you need.
So what does the Copenhagen Accord mean? It seals a commitment to limit global temperature rises to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, but crucially sets no firm targets to do that. It creates a fund of billions of dollars to help poor and vulnerable countries fight climate change. And it allows an international exchange of information on carbon emission cuts. There is no timescale to turn this document into a legally binding deal. Realistically, this is a step forward. What has been agreed here by some will be introduced in the next few weeks, and those countries believe it will make a difference. But there is a sense of frustration and anger because a summit which promised so much has delivered so little. The UN's top climate change envoy says the agenda for the next gathering is now clear.
Well, I think we've got to achieve in Mexico all the things that we were supposed to achieve here.
The US may see this as meaningful and unprecedented, but this was a gathering of 192 countries. And if all are to agree a plan to fight climate change, then tortuous negotiations lie ahead in the weeks and years to come.
Well, joining us today to discuss this further from Brussels, Daniela Vincenti-Mitchener, the managing editor of Euractiv, an online European news portal. She's just returned from the climate change summit in Copenhagen. From New Delhi, we have Vandana Shiva, an ecologist and environmental activist. And from Birmingham, we're joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. Thank you all of you for joining us. Vandana Shiva, if I could start off with you. Ban Ki-moon said it was an essential beginning. Barack Obama said it was a first step. Wouldn't many be saying, wasn't Rio de Janeiro in 1992, 17 years ago, the first step? Doesn't the world need more than just essential beginnings right now?
Well, the point is denying the origins of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and also trying to totally bypass and sidestep the Kyoto Protocol, which was initiated in 1997, is precisely what this so-called agreement, so-called Accord of Copenhagen is designed to do. It's meant to undo the legally binding agreement that had already been reached by all countries of the world. So President Obama was wrong to say this was the first time leaders of the world gathered. The world doesn't start when Obama comes into the picture. Secondly, he's totally wrong in saying the 2-degree recognition is for the first time. Already the G8 summit in L'Aquila had already committed itself to that, and the IPCC and the scientific community has been waking the world up on this too. Basically, what I see this so-called accord doing is undoing the agreement that existed, and that's why I think it is not right to present it as a new beginning to move towards a legally binding system. It has hurt the steps that were being taken and the urgency that had been brought to Copenhagen and the willingness to negotiate, because when the Danes dropped a draft which looked very much like this final accord, everyone got organized and say we will not have undemocratic imposition of agendas. Unfortunately, democracy, international democracy, which is exercised through the United Nations system, was subverted. So the world has been hurt, the planet has been hurt, and on the basis of this so-called accord with the emerging countries, which is such a strange name for ancient civilizations like China and India, United States should be called emerging because it's the newborn country on the planet. What we have really signed on to is a new policing by the United States. Exactly the country which has refused to cut emissions, the country that has refused to be part of the international system of mitigation, now becomes the world's climate policeman.
Right.
And that is going to hurt sovereignty, but most dangerous. While the United Nations Secretary of the Convention is saying we have to do in Mexico what we didn't get done in Copenhagen, unfortunately, a very fragmented community will go to Mexico. Most people haven't signed. Most people are very angry that in spite of 2 years of work on the follow-up to Kyoto and in spite of 2 weeks of struggles in negotiations, people were just bypassed.
Okay.
And that is insulting.
All right, let's flesh this out as we go along. Let's bring in Daniela Vincenti-Mitchener. Vandana Shiva says this was undemocratically imposed upon all those members. Do you agree that two countries, the US and China, made decisions for 193?
Well, the EU was very disappointed. As you know, the accord was a US-led accord done behind the scene with China, Brazil, India, and South Africa. This was the basis of the accord. Of course, that disappointed many, and especially civil society that was witnessing what was happening. But let's face it, Kyoto was not ratified by the US, and we need to have the US on board. A year ago, a US negotiator for the Kyoto Protocol told the EU that it was unrealistic to have an accord in Copenhagen. Copenhagen arrived 1 year too early, I believe. And we have witnessed a widening divide between developing countries and developed countries over the past months. So it was expected. The gentleman agreement that was signed in Copenhagen is what was expected. I think what Obama said, and he was very clear, is that we need to build trust. I think now it's the time to build trust. And the accord, if you look carefully at the accord, by January 2010, so by end of next month, they will need to provide, every country will need to provide a list of things that it intends to do.
Right.
And it will be a list, I believe, name or shame.
But sorry to interrupt you, you have a more optimistic view of this than Vandana Shiva. However, looking at some of the crucial details that I suppose we can say were omitted, the fact that this has not been formally legally adopted, the fact that there's no peak year mentioned, the fact that there's no collective target for cutting emissions, doesn't all of that disturb you?
It does disturb me. Of course it disturbs me, because we were expecting a legally binding agreement by 2 years ago. That's what we were told we were going to get. It is disturbing. But let's face it, we're going towards a new world order. And this is what the European Parliament has repeated, actually. We're going, and the G20 was put in place just recently. You need those 20 countries, which are the major emitters of the world, to become trustworthy of each other. And unless you build the legally binding agreement on something that is trustworthy, it will fall apart. So I personally believe it is a first step, and we need to work harder, obviously. And I think the EU is very disheartened by this accord because it worked very, very hard to reach a legally binding agreement. But the fact is we need the US on board and we need China.
All right, we'll come back to you, Vandana Shiva. I know you want to come in there, but let's bring in Scott Lucas for the moment. Mr. Lucas, Daniela Vincenti-Mitchener said that this is about building trust amid a new world order. What do you make of that?
I think that's a very shrewd way of reading it, because I can understand the anger and the frustration that this is not the end of the beginning, that we didn't get an accord. But we needed to get a beginning of the beginning, because we lost over a decade after Kyoto, in part because the United States walked away from the process, and in part because developing nations said, if you don't have the United States in, and if you don't have China in, we're not going to make sacrifices just while developed countries do nothing. The fact is that Copenhagen didn't produce an agreement, but at least you have countries such as the United States who are no longer climate change deniers. They at least acknowledge that something is happening. The key issue now is do we move beyond the beginning of the beginning, whereas if you come back to me after the Mexico summit, that we actually have some movement towards an agreed target, towards some kind of binding timetable, and most importantly, going beyond national agendas to having some type of international agreement. And that's really something that's going to be the acid test, the hard test of negotiation, both behind the scenes and in public over the next year.
Vandana Shiva?
Yeah, the first thing is that it is not true that this has led to a building of trust. But if you just listen to what the G77 representative from Sudan is saying, he's calling it a suicide pact for Africa. So the majority of countries have been pushed into distrust just to have a trust, not of the countries, not of the people of these 5 countries that initiated the accord, but of the corporations of these 5 countries to say, let us have a non-binding accord so that we can continue to pollute, we can continue to fudge figures. Let me just run down the example of fudging of figures. Obama came to Copenhagen claiming a 70% reduction. That 17% is on the basis of 2005. If you measure the cuts in emissions that Obama was promising on the 1990 baseline, it is a mere 3%, even less than what Kyoto required. China and India talking about carbon intensity as a ratio of GDP, not of absolute reduction. So what you really have is not a gentleman's accord. What you have is a polluter's accord to keep polluting and have no legally binding instrument. For those who say getting Obama on board was vital, getting the US on board was vital, but you get him on board the wrong train. This train is taking us to climate catastrophe. We all needed to be on the train to solve the problem of climate change. Yes. So a train in the wrong direction with Obama as the driver doesn't solve the climate problem. It's interesting that you mentioned the Sudanese negotiator, Lumumba Stanislas Diaping, because he also said this, he called it an incineration for Africa, and he likened the attitude of rich countries to that of the Nazi Holocaust. Now, isn't that the type of rhetoric and histrionics that tends to isolate those who don't know where they stand on the issue? It makes a mockery of it, doesn't it? It's an exaggeration, Vandana. No, because they're not isolated. This is the majority of countries feeling that way. 5 countries agree to an accord. About 30 have signed it so far. The European Union, just through sheer embarrassment for not even being counted among the major players or among the economic powers of the world. And yes, there's a change in the world order, but it's a result of globalization, a result of what I have called the outsourcing of pollution, the deliberate moving of pollutant and pollution-intensive, resource-intensive, energy-intensive industry to countries like China and India, so that our people subsidize the consumption of the North and the corporations of the North who maximize their profits through this outsourcing. So this new world order, of course, needs to be taken seriously, and we need to intimately see the connections between how the global economic order that is driven by the World Trade Organization and the World Bank on the one hand, and what was done with the Copenhagen Accord to make it more consistent with the WTO World Bank model, rather than with the environmental solutions through an environmental agreement that had been initiated at the Earth Summit.
Okay, let's bring in Daniela Vincenti-Mitchener. Daniela, what was agreed was to limit the temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius. That's in the document. 2 degrees, is that achievable, and is that enough?
Of course not. If you take the small island states, they were calling for 1.5. It is obvious that we need to act very rapidly in order at least to reach the 2 degrees centigrade. But I want to, I listen carefully to what China and India the prime ministers and president have said during the plenary. And this doesn't mean, the accord was an international accord, but it doesn't mean that both countries are not going to embark in a low-carbon economy. And I stress the economy because this is all an economic game. It's the economy stupid. And what we have seen is that we need to put in place the right conditions for that, to do that leap forward into a new economic order. And Shiba rightly said, I think it's all an economic game, and it will push countries because they want to be competitive to embark on renewables and tackling deforestation. And I believe there is something substantial that came out, which is tackling deforestation. And that will be at least one push to lower emissions in the next years.
Okay.
But I really believe it was too early to have international legally binding. I think we need to start to act now domestically, and the US has a bill that is going through the Congress and didn't want to jeopardize that domestic process, which is very important for the world as well. So I think it is possibly, and I hope the EU is going to put tremendous pressure on the US in the next year to have them commit to a more substantial deal in the future.
Okay, let's bring in Scott Lucas. Scott, Daniela Vincenti-Mitchener mentioned that famous quote, "It's the economy, stupid." Along those lines, let's talk a little bit about money. $30 billion in 3 years, $100 billion a year by 2020. Developing countries like Bangladesh or islands like the Maldives, however upset they may be with what came out of Copenhagen, can't say no to that sort of money, can they?
It's hard to turn it down, but it is only a short-term, as it were, salve to cover up the bigger issue. You know, for 3 centuries, most of the world has been involved in a system of capitalism, which means you consume more, you produce more in order to grow. And the basic question that has to be addressed is not that we consume or produce more, but given the environmental question, we have to consume differently and we have to produce differently. Now, aid may ease the transition for some of these countries as they begin to change their economies. But frankly, there has to be basically an agreement that whether we're talking about new technologies, about new patterns of trade, about new patterns of consumption, that this is really an international question. And I do think that in this case, the $30 billion you referred to was almost sort of a get out of environmental jail card by the developed countries right now to put that issue off. I don't think you can come back 12 months from now and simply hand out a few more $1 billion of aid without addressing the questions that both of your speakers have already raised. That there has to be a different type of pattern of economic development in which there will be sacrifices that will be agreed upon.
Vandana, I saw you nodding in agreement there.
Yeah, I'm totally nodding in agreement because it's true the ultimate issue is changing patterns of consumption, and first the patterns of production that have been driven by fossil fuels, externalities, and the climate chaos that those externalities have created. But the 30 billion is not in aid. The accord is very clear. It's through many instruments, including the private sector, including carbon emission trading. Now, I know my country's carbon emission trading, and I know China's carbon emission trading. All of the clean development mechanism money already accounts for 30 billion globally in terms of emission trading. And in terms of what it does in our countries, it doesn't support the clean development path. It supports sponge iron plants, HCFC plants, etc. It's all become a scam bigger than the subprime crisis, bigger than the Wall Street bubble. And we now have a carbon bubble in place, which will just grow bigger. And that's the money that's being talked about, not real support to make a shift to renewable energy base, but really a scam within a scam within a scam. And that, I think, is what we have to seriously worry about. It's not the case that this money is coming for a transition to sustainable renewable economies.
Daniela, do you agree it's a scam within a scam within a scam?
Well, I don't agree. I've been reading a lot on national action plans being put in place, big solar power projects being developed in China and India. I think it will be up, to ensure competitiveness and growth. They will need to embark on that race. And I believe there will be a movement towards more sustainable way of living. There will be, I hope, also policies that will follow in terms of telling citizens and giving them information that they have to change the way they live. And it will be a whole humankind movement towards more sustainable type of living. So a scam is a scam. I think we have raised, some politicians and some scientists have raised awareness, and that scam will not, it will be short-lived, because it will be exposed.
Okay, we're running out of time. As a final question to Scott Lucas, very briefly, Scott, bearing in mind that the US and China in agreement spearheaded this deal, what does Copenhagen say about the future global political picture?
Well, with respect, I would take it beyond the US and China. I think there are other countries that were involved: India, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia. And let's not underestimate, despite the criticisms here, that the developing countries did make some very serious points that were recognized here, even if you don't like the final fudge on the agreement. This is not just simply the U.S. and the China leading us to a solution, nor is it just the U.S. and China blocking us from a solution. The first step to getting some kind of agreement is recognition, and that we got at Copenhagen. The question is that after recognition, you have to have action. And that has to be action that is not just dictated by Washington and Beijing. You have to recognize there are many more countries that are going to be involved in this process.
All right, thank you very much. We have run out of time. Scott Lucas, Vandana Shiva and Daniela Vincenti-Mitchener. It was a pleasure talking to all of you. Thanks for tuning in to Inside Story. You can drop us a line with your comments and suggestions by emailing us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. You're watching Al Jazeera. Stay with us.